A judge fined a royal guard for breaking protocol, certain he could make an example of him. But when the guard revealed his legal genius, he realized he had chosen the wrong man to challenge. Here's what happened next. Now, before we continue, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. And make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow at this very same time, we're dropping another powerful royal guard story that you won't want to miss. The summer sun beat down on the cobblestones outside Buckingham Palace, casting long shadows across the courtyard where Lieutenant Ivor Blackstone stood at attention. His scarlet tunic remained impeccable despite the sweltering heat, his posture a testament to 8 years of military discipline. Behind the ceremonial bearskin cap and beneath the immaculate uniform stood not just a soldier, but a man whose path to the Queen's Guard had been anything but conventional. Blackstone's eyes remained fixed forward, his expression unreadable as tourists gathered for photographs. The morning crowd was typical: families with excited children, couples posing for selfies, and the occasional visitor who tested boundaries trying to provoke a reaction. Blackstone had seen it all, weathering both blistering summers and freezing winters with the same stoic dedication that had earned him commendations in Afghanistan before his current posting. The commotion began quietly. A soft gasp, followed by concerned murmurs from the crowd. In his peripheral vision, Blackstone detected movement where there shouldn't have been any. An elderly woman, perhaps in her 70s, clutched at her chest and began to crumple toward the ground, her face ashen. Protocol was clear: remain at attention unless the palace itself was threatened. Guards had stood unmoved through rainstorms, medical emergencies, and even the occasional unconscious tourist. But Blackstone had also sworn an oath to protect. And in the split second before the woman hit the pavement, he made his decision. With military precision, Blackstone stepped forward, catching the woman before she collapsed completely. "Ma'am, are you all right?" His voice, unused for hours on duty, was steady and calm. The woman's pulse fluttered weakly beneath his gloved fingers as he gently lowered her to a seated position. "Someone call for medical assistance," he commanded, his tone carrying the authority of battlefield experience. Several tourists pulled out phones, dialing emergency services, as Blackstone maintained his position, supporting the elderly woman. Her breathing was laboured, her skin clammy. "I have heart medication," she whispered, gesturing weakly to her purse. Blackstone retrieved the small pill bottle, helping her take the medication while ensuring her airway remained clear. "Stand aside! What's going on here?" A sharp voice cut through the concerned murmurs of the crowd. A tall man in an immaculately tailored suit pushed forward, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the stones with impatient authority. "Why has this guard abandoned his post?" Lawrence Montgomery didn't wait for an answer as he surveyed the scene, his cold grey eyes taking in the situation with a prosecutor's calculated assessment. The gold cufflinks at his wrists caught the sunlight as he gestured dismissively. His signet ring, bearing the crest of the Royal Courts of Justice, made his profession evident to those who recognized such symbols of judicial authority. "Sir, we have a medical emergency," a young woman from the crowd explained. "The guard is helping." "I can see what he's doing," Montgomery interrupted, checking his Patek Philippe watch with visible irritation. "What I don't see is any justification for abandoning ceremonial duties." Paramedics arrived within minutes, their efficient movements a blur of practiced precision as they took over care of the elderly woman. "Suspected cardiac event," Blackstone informed them quietly, his assessment reflecting medical training that few tourists would have guessed he possessed. "She's taken 1 dose of nitroglycerin approximately 3 minutes ago." The paramedics nodded appreciatively at the detailed report. As they transferred the woman to a stretcher, she grasped Blackstone's hand. "Thank you, young man. I don't know what would have happened if—" "That's enough," Montgomery cut in. "The emergency services are here now. I believe you have a post to return to, guard." Blackstone straightened, his face returning to its ceremonial impassivity. With textbook precision, he pivoted and marched back to his position, resuming his stance with the same perfection that had defined his service. To observers, he appeared every inch the dutiful guard once more, giving no indication of the Oxford law degree that had preceded his military career or the distinction with which he'd served in both professions. Montgomery straightened his tie, a mirthless smile spreading across his face as he watched Blackstone return to position. The judge's fingers tapped against his leather briefcase, his mind already formulating the approach he would take with this guard who had dared break protocol, even for a worthy cause. As the paramedics wheeled the elderly woman toward the waiting ambulance, Montgomery stood with arms crossed, watching Blackstone resume his post with military precision. The guard's face had returned to its ceremonial mask of stoicism, eyes forward, posture perfect, as though the brief deviation had never occurred. "You there, guard," Montgomery called out, his voice carrying the practiced projection of a man accustomed to commanding courtrooms. "I need to speak with you about what just transpired." He approached with measured steps, positioning himself directly in Blackstone's line of sight, where the guard would be forced to look at him, or through him, as protocol demanded. The crowd began to disperse, the excitement of the medical emergency fading, but a few lingered, sensing a new tension in the air. Among them, two men in their 60s wearing Royal Marines veteran pins exchanged concerned glances, their weathered faces betraying unease at Montgomery's approach. "I am Judge Lawrence Montgomery of the Crown Court," he announced, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "And what I've just witnessed is a clear dereliction of duty." He leaned closer, his cologne, expensive and overpowering, creating an invisible barrier between himself and the common tourists. "Your singular responsibility is to maintain your post, is it not? Not to play at being a paramedic." Blackstone remained motionless, his eyes fixed forward as regulations required. The subtle tightening of his jaw was imperceptible to most observers, but it would have spoken volumes to those who knew him. "Nothing to say for yourself?" Montgomery pressed, his thin lips curling into something between a smile and a sneer. "Perhaps you're unaware that breaking Royal Guard protocol carries significant penalties. Section 12 of the Military Conduct Code makes that abundantly clear." One of the veterans shifted uncomfortably. There was no such section in any code governing the Queen's Guard, but Montgomery continued with the confidence of a man accustomed to having his legal assertions accepted without question. "I could have you fined a month's wages on the spot," Montgomery continued, his voice dropping to a quieter, more threatening tone. "I have the authority. Or perhaps you'd prefer formal charges. Abandonment of post can carry up to 6 months' detention, especially in cases where palace security could have been compromised." A woman nearby gasped softly at the severity of the threat, which only seemed to encourage Montgomery further. He straightened his already impeccable tie, a gesture that seemed habitual when he was building to a point. "Your silence only confirms your guilt," he declared, beginning to pace before Blackstone like a prosecutor addressing a jury. "Do you have any idea how many tourists witnessed your breaking of sacred protocol? How many foreign visitors will return home with the impression that Britain's famed discipline is nothing but theatre?" The crowd had begun to grow again, drawn by Montgomery's increasingly theatrical performance. Several people had pulled children closer, uncomfortable with the public dressing down of a uniformed serviceman. "Sir," a middle-aged woman tried to interject, "he was helping someone in distress." "Madam, I am a Crown Court judge," Montgomery cut her off without looking in her direction. "I believe I understand the law rather better than you do." His attention never left Blackstone, who maintained his forward gaze with practiced discipline. "This isn't about helping someone. This is about upholding centuries of tradition and protocol." The two veterans had moved closer now, their posture suggesting military background even decades after service. The taller one shook his head slightly as Montgomery continued his tirade. "The fine will be substantial. Montgomery declared, pulling a small notebook from his breast pocket as though preparing to write an actual citation. I'm thinking £500 would be appropriate, though the court might push for more once I file my report. He made a show of checking his watch again. Of course, if you'd care to explain yourself now, I might be persuaded to show leniency. Blackstone's continued silence seemed to infuriate Montgomery further. The judge's face flushed slightly as he took another step closer, invading the invisible boundary that tourists instinctively respected. Perhaps you don't fully grasp the seriousness of your position. Montgomery's voice hardened. I've seen men like you before, thinking the uniform grants some special immunity from the law. Let me assure you, it does not. By this time tomorrow, you could be facing disciplinary action that ends your career. Is that what you want, guard? Still, Blackstone remained motionless, the perfect image of Royal Guard discipline. But behind his impassive expression, years of legal training were already analysing every false citation and hollow threat Montgomery had issued. The summer heat intensified as noon approached, but it was Montgomery's growing fury that seemed to raise the temperature around Buckingham Palace's grounds. His perfectly manicured finger jabbed the air inches from Blackstone's chest as he continued his lecture. Statute 23 of the Royal Protection Act clearly states that abandoning one's post, even momentarily, constitutes a breach of national security protocol, Montgomery declared, his voice rising with each fabricated legal reference, which carries a minimum penalty of— "Excuse me, sir," a soft voice interrupted. A young woman with a guidebook clutched in her hands had stepped forward. "I think the guard did the right thing. That lady might have died without help." Montgomery turned, fixing her with a stare that had silenced many a courtroom. "The right thing? Let me educate you on what the right thing actually means in legal terms." His tone dripped with condescension. "Royal Guards serve at the pleasure of the Crown under regulations that date back centuries. Those regulations don't include medical interventions." The woman stepped back, chastened by his authoritative tone, but the interruption had only inflamed Montgomery further. He turned back to Blackstone with renewed intensity. Section 47, paragraph 3 of Military Discipline Protocols mandates immediate suspension for any ceremonial guard who abandons their post without direct orders from a superior officer. He continued, the fictitious citations flowing effortlessly. "I don't suppose you had such orders when you decided to play hero." Blackstone maintained his perfect forward gaze, standing so still he might have been carved from stone. The beads of sweat at his temples were the only indication that he was flesh and blood, rather than a ceremonial statue. Behind his disciplined exterior, however, his mind catalogued each false statute, an invented regulation Montgomery spouted. The two veterans had moved closer now, their weathered faces set in grim lines. The shorter one, whose chest bore service medals from conflicts decades past, whispered something to his companion. Both men watched Montgomery with the wary attention of soldiers assessing a threat. "Your continuing silence only compounds your offences," Montgomery announced, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Failure to respond to a Crown Court judge conducting an official inquiry adds obstruction of justice to your growing list of violations." He made a show of adding this to his notebook, though his pen never actually touched the paper. A young father pulled his son away from the gathering crowd, murmuring, "Come on, let's go," clearly uncomfortable with the scene unfolding. Several tourists had begun to film discreetly on their phones, their expressions revealing discomfort with Montgomery's increasingly aggressive demeanour. "Perhaps you don't fully comprehend the severity of your situation," Montgomery continued, moving even closer to Blackstone. "I am empowered by the Court Justice Act to issue summary judgments for contempt." £5,000 and 30 days, he threatened, naming a penalty that exceeded anything remotely reasonable for the supposed offence. The taller veteran took a half step forward, but was restrained by his companion's hand on his arm. "Not yet," the shorter man whispered. "Wait." Montgomery's face had flushed to a dangerous shade of red, his frustration at Blackstone's continued silence building to something volatile. "I've sentenced men for far less than what you've done today," he hissed, lowering his voice to an intimate threat. "One phone call from me, and your military career ends this afternoon." Blackstone's expression remained impassive, but something changed in his eyes. A subtle sharpening of focus that might have warned a more observant man than Montgomery that he was treading on dangerous ground. The Parliamentary Protection of Ceremonial Guards Act of 1998 specifically prohibits any deviation from prescribed protocols, Montgomery continued, inventing legislation with growing abandon. Violations are punishable by immediate, dishonourable discharge and forfeiture of pension benefits. An elderly woman in the crowd tutted disapprovingly, not at Blackstone, but at Montgomery's display. "Disgraceful," she murmured audibly, "harassing the poor man for helping someone." Montgomery spun toward her, nostrils flaring. "Madam, I suggest you keep your uninformed opinions to yourself, or you may find yourself charged with interfering in a judicial proceeding." The threat was as hollow as his citations, but delivered with enough authority to make the woman step back. When he turned back to Blackstone, Montgomery's composure had cracked further. He pulled out his phone, making a show of dialing. "Perhaps you'll take this more seriously when I have your commanding officer on the line," he said. "Or better yet, the Minister of Defence. I had dinner with him just last week, you know." The phone call was clearly for show. Montgomery wasn't actually speaking to anyone as he continued his performance. "Yes, Minister, I'm at Buckingham Palace where I've witnessed a shocking breach of protocol. A guard abandoned his post to involve himself in a civilian matter." He paused for an imaginary response. "Yes, quite serious indeed. I've cited him under sections 12, 47 and the Parliamentary Act of 98. The veterans exchanged knowing glances. No such call was taking place, no such acts existed. Montgomery was revealing himself with every fabricated word. The manufactured phone call concluded with Montgomery making a show of ending the conversation, his expression one of grim satisfaction. "Well, that settles it," he announced, pocketing his phone with theatrical finality. "The minister agrees completely. Immediate suspension, pending formal charges." By now a circle had formed around Blackstone and Montgomery, onlookers drawn by the spectacle despite their discomfort. The confrontation had taken on the air of street theatre, with Montgomery playing to the audience, even as he focused his ire on the impassive guard. "I'm giving you one final opportunity to acknowledge your misconduct," Montgomery declared, his voice carrying the practiced projection of courtroom declarations. "Admit that you violated protocol, apologize for your actions, and perhaps I can be persuaded to reduce the penalties to something less career-ending." Blackstone remained perfectly still, his forward gaze unwavering. The only sign of the tension might have been a slight whitening of his knuckles on the ceremonial rifle, imperceptible to casual observers, but noted by the veterans watching from nearby. "Nothing to say," Montgomery's voice dropped dangerously. "Very well, we'll do this the hard way." He stepped even closer, removing a business card from his wallet and holding it directly in Blackstone's line of sight. "My chambers are expecting your formal response by noon tomorrow. Failure to appear will result in a warrant for your arrest." A murmur ran through the crowd at this escalation. One of the veterans shook his head in disgust, whispering to his companion, "This has gone far enough." Montgomery seemed to feed on the audience's reaction, his performance growing more expansive. "Perhaps you think your uniform shields you from legal consequences," he continued, circling Blackstone like a prosecutor closing in for the kill. "Many have made that mistake in my courtroom. None have made it twice." The tension in the air had become almost tangible, the summer heat amplifying the discomfort of everyone present. Several tourists had begun to drift away, parents shepherding children from the increasingly unpleasant scene. Others remained fixed in place, uncertain whether intervention was appropriate, but equally uncomfortable with silent observation. "I wonder," Montgomery mused, his voice dripping with false concern, What your family will think when they learn their son threw away his military career for a momentary lapse in judgment. Such a waste. The mockery in his tone was unmistakable now, any pretense of judicial impartiality long abandoned. The taller veteran took a definitive step forward, but his companion again restrained him. "Not our fight yet," the shorter man cautioned, though his own expression had hardened to granite. Montgomery checked his watch again, a habitual gesture that seemed designed to remind everyone of how valuable his time was. "I have a court session in 2 hours. Important matters. Unlike this waste of my morning," he straightened his already impeccable suit jacket, "I expect this matter to be concluded before I reach my chambers." Blackstone's continued silence seemed to push Montgomery beyond the last boundaries of his composure. His face contorted with a flash of naked rage, quickly masked behind judicial authority, but revealing nonetheless. "You are hereby officially cited for violations of Sections 1223 and 47 of the Royal Protection Statutes," he announced, his voice rising to ensure everyone heard. "As a Crown Court judge, I am exercising my authority to issue an immediate fine of £10,000 and to recommend dishonourable discharge from Her Majesty's service." The absurdity of the declaration, citing non-existent statutes and claiming powers no judge possessed, might have been comical in another context. Here, with Montgomery's finger now jabbing toward Blackstone's chest, it had crossed into something darker. "Consider yourself formally charged," Montgomery concluded, his finger moving the final inch to make contact with Blackstone's scarlet tunic, directly above the regimental insignia. The physical contact, that single pointed prod of his manicured finger, was delivered with the certainty of a man accustomed to immunity from consequences. That single touch hung in the air like a thunderclap before a storm. The veterans straightened simultaneously, their postures shifting to military readiness. Several onlookers gasped softly, and Blackstone, whose perfect stillness had seemed unbreakable, moved his eyes for the first time, looking directly into Montgomery's with sniper's precision. The moment stretched, taut with potential energy. Montgomery's finger remained pressed against the scarlet uniform, his expression fixed in triumphant certainty. He had no way of knowing he had just made the one mistake that would shatter his illusion of authority. "Sir, I must respectfully ask you to remove your hand from my uniform." Blackstone's voice cut through the tense silence with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel, calm, measured, and carrying absolute authority. The transformation was immediate and stunning. Where moments before had stood a ceremonial figure, now stood a man whose bearing radiated controlled power. Montgomery blinked, momentarily startled by the sudden break in character. His finger remained where it was, pressed against the scarlet tunic, as his brain processed the unexpected development. "So you've decided to speak after all," he recovered, attempting to maintain his dominant position. "Too late for that, I'm afraid. The charges have been filed." "No, sir, they have not," Blackstone replied, his tone carrying the quiet confidence of someone on familiar ground. He took a precise step back, removing Montgomery's finger from his uniform with the movement. "There are no sections 12, 23, or 47 in any royal protection statute. No parliamentary protection of ceremonial guards. Guards Act exists. And you have neither the authority to issue fines nor recommend military discharges." The crowd's collective intake of breath was audible. Montgomery's face froze in an expression of stunned surprise before quickly rearranging itself into judicial indignation. "How dare you question my authority?" "I'm not questioning your judicial authority, sir," Blackstone interrupted with calm precision. "I'm stating, as a matter of legal fact, that you are attempting to exercise powers you do not possess, citing statutes that do not exist, and making threats you cannot enforce." Montgomery's mouth opened and closed wordlessly for a moment. Blackstone continued before he could recover. "Before joining the Queen's Guard, I completed my law degree at Oxford, with first-class honours, specialising in constitutional and military law. I am intimately familiar with the actual regulations governing my position. Blackstone's posture remained perfect, his delivery measured and precise. Royal Guard Protocol Section 5, Paragraph 3, explicitly permits ceremonial guards to break formation in cases of immediate threat to public safety or health. The medical emergency I responded to falls squarely within those parameters. Montgomery's face had drained of colour, the florid confidence of moments ago replaced by a sickly pallor. You cannot possibly expect me to believe. Furthermore, Blackstone continued, his voice never rising yet somehow commanding complete attention, the physical contact you just initiated constitutes battery against a serving member of Her Majesty's Armed Forces, which under the Military Personnel Protection Act of for a statute that actually exists, is punishable by up to 2 years' imprisonment. The veterans had moved forward now, flanking Blackstone at a respectful distance. The shorter one nodded almost imperceptibly, approval evident in his weathered features. Your claim to have spoken with the Minister of Defence is particularly troubling, Blackstone continued, his legal training evident in the methodical dismantling of Montgomery's position. Making false claims of government authority constitutes misconduct in public office, a common law offence carrying a maximum sentence of life imprisonment. The fact that you did so while identifying yourself as a Crown Court judge compounds the severity significantly. Montgomery had begun to back away, his earlier swagger evaporating with each precise legal citation Blackstone delivered. This is absurd. I was merely... Additionally, Blackstone pressed on, your attempt to issue fabricated citations while presenting yourself as acting in your judicial capacity constitutes a clear violation of the Judicial Conduct Regulations, specifically Principle 3 regarding integrity, propriety and impartiality. The crowd had gone completely silent, hanging on every word of Blackstone's response. Even children seemed to sense the gravity of what was unfolding. I am familiar with your record on the bench, Judge Montgomery, Blackstone continued, his tone shifting subtly. Your handling of the Westfield case last year raised serious questions about judicial temperament, questions that were ultimately dismissed due to insufficient evidence. This incident, however, has been witnessed by dozens of civilians, 2 retired military officers, and is almost certainly recorded on palace security cameras. Montgomery's face had gone from pale to ashen. You can't possibly. I can and I must, Blackstone replied evenly. As a serving member of Her Majesty's Armed Forces and a qualified legal professional, I have a duty to report attempted misconduct in public office. Your fabricated statutes, non-existent phone call to the minister, and attempt to exercise authority you do not possess will all feature prominently in that report. The taller veteran stepped forward. Lieutenant Colonel James Whitmore, retired, he introduced himself, his bearing unmistakably military despite decades of civilian life. I served 30 years, including 5 as a military judge. I'll be happy to provide my own witness statement regarding this incident. His companion nodded. Major Richard Hargrove, 28 years' service. I believe I caught most of your invented statutes on my phone recording, Judge Montgomery. Remarkable performance. Montgomery's composure had completely crumbled now, his earlier imperious manner replaced by stunned disbelief. There's been a misunderstanding, he stammered, adjusting his tie with fingers that trembled slightly. I was merely attempting to ensure proper protocol was... I understand completely, sir, Blackstone replied, his tone professionally neutral. Misrepresentations of the law can indeed lead to serious misunderstandings. Fortunately, the actual statutes are quite clear on both my actions during the medical emergency and your conduct afterward. With military precision, Blackstone returned to his ceremonial stance, eyes forward, posture perfect, but not before delivering his final observation. Your contact with my uniform constituted battery. Your misrepresentation of judicial authority constituted misconduct in public office. Both are serious offences. I suggest you consult with legal counsel at your earliest convenience." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant sounds of London traffic and Montgomery's ragged breathing as he confronted the ruins of his authority. Montgomery stood frozen in place, the colour draining from his face, as the full implications of Blackstone's response sank in. His hand moved unconsciously to straighten his tie, a nervous gesture now, rather than one of authority. The crowd remained silent, witnessing the stunning reversal of fortune with collective held breath. There seems to have been a misunderstanding," Montgomery finally managed, his voice stripped of its earlier commanding tone. "I was merely concerned about proper protocol and fabricating legal statutes while presenting yourself as acting in an official capacity isn't a misunderstanding, Judge Montgomery," Lieutenant Colonel Whitmore interjected, his voice carrying the weight of his decades in military justice. "It's misconduct in public office." Montgomery took a step backward, bumping into a tourist who quickly moved away. "I never claimed to be acting in an official capacity," he protested weakly. "I was simply offering my professional opinion on a matter of public interest." While citing non-existent laws, claiming to call a government minister, and physically touching a guard's uniform, after identifying yourself as a Crown Court judge, Major Hargrove added, his phone still recording. "Interesting interpretation of not acting in an official capacity, wouldn't you say, James?" Whitmore nodded gravely. "Most interesting. I wonder if the Judicial Conduct Investigations Office would share that interpretation." Montgomery's eyes darted between the retired officers, Blackstone, who had returned to his ceremonial stance with perfect composure, and the silent crowd of witnesses. The carefully constructed facade of judicial authority had completely crumbled, leaving only a man desperately seeking escape from a situation spinning beyond his control. "This entire situation has been blown out of proportion," Montgomery attempted, his voice higher than before. "I was merely expressing concern about ceremonial standards. There was no intent to be—" "Your intent was quite clear from your statements, sir," Blackstone interrupted, his eyes once again fixed forward in proper ceremonial position, though he continued to speak. "You explicitly claimed judicial authority to issue fines and recommend military discharge. You physically touched a guard's uniform after repeated escalation. Your intent is a matter of record, witnessed by dozens and captured on multiple recording devices." A woman stepped forward from the crowd, her expression resolute. "I have the entire incident on video," she confirmed, "including all the made-up laws and the fake phone call to the minister." Montgomery's shoulders slumped visibly. The realization seemed to dawn on him that there would be no easy escape from the consequences of his actions. "I may have overstepped," he conceded, each word seemingly extracted under duress. "A momentary lapse in judgment. Surely we can resolve this without further escalation." Lieutenant Colonel Whitmore exchanged glances with Major Hargrove before responding. "That would depend on Lieutenant Blackstone. As the serving officer directly affected by your conduct, the decision to file formal charges would be primarily his." All eyes turned to Blackstone, who remained in perfect ceremonial stance, his expression unreadable. The crowd waited, tension building in the summer air. Lieutenant Blackstone acted with distinction during a medical emergency, potentially saving a life while adhering to the actual protocols governing his position, Whitmore continued. "Your attempt to intimidate and threaten him afterward was unconscionable." Montgomery swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly above his expensive tie. "I realize now that I was misinformed about certain protocols," he managed, the words clearly painful to utter. "My behavior was inappropriate. I apologize unreservedly." The apology hung in the air, its sincerity questionable, but its necessity undeniable. After a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, Blackstone spoke one final time, never breaking his forward gaze. "Your apology is noted, sir. I would strongly advise reviewing both the Judicial Code of Conduct and the actual statutes governing military personnel before any similar situations arise in future. Good day." With that, Blackstone returned to complete silence, the perfect embodiment of Royal Guard discipline. Montgomery stood for a moment longer, deflated and diminished, before turning to make his retreat through the now dispersing crowd. Several tourists stepped deliberately aside, creating a path that felt more like a gauntlet of judgment than an escape route. Lieutenant Colonel Whitmore and Major Hargrove remained briefly, exchanging respectful nods with each other before departing. The incident had concluded as decisively as it had begun, with Blackstone now standing exactly as he had been before. The perfect image of ceremonial discipline, betraying no sign of the legal brilliance that had so thoroughly dismantled Montgomery's pretensions of authority. As normal activity resumed around Buckingham Palace, tourists taking photos and life continuing its rhythms, Blackstone remained at his post, his discipline unbroken. The only difference was the newfound respect in the eyes of those who approached, a subtle acknowledgement that behind the ceremonial uniform stood a man of exceptional qualities, intelligence, courage, and an unwavering commitment to both his military duties and the truth. What would you do if you witnessed someone abusing their authority, attempting to intimidate others with fabricated laws and hollow threats? Judge Montgomery discovered the hard way that appearances can be deceiving, and assumptions about others can lead to humbling lessons. This encounter reminds us that true respect isn't demanded through intimidation or false authority. It's earned through integrity, knowledge, and principled action. Lieutenant Blackstone's response wasn't just a defense of himself, but a defense of the very legal principles the judge claimed to uphold. How many times have we judged others based solely on their appearance or position, failing to recognize the depth of character and knowledge they might possess? And how often do we allow those who speak loudly and with confidence to go unchallenged, even when their claims don't add up? If this story made you think about the importance of standing up for what's right, even when facing intimidation, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories about Royal Guards and the values they represent. Press the bell icon to never miss our uploads, and check out the other videos appearing on your screen right now. Have you ever encountered someone who tried to intimidate others with false authority? How did you respond? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your stories. And we'll see you again tomorrow at the same time with another brand new story.